right. Hello and welcome to Social Cognition. This installment on affect, mood, and emotions is the, I believe, fifth round of social cognition that we're doing together online. And let's get started by taking a look at what it is that we will do in this session. We will, first of all, have to make some definitions. So we'll talk about what the differences between when we talk about affect, mood, and emotions. Then we'll speak about how we can induce affect in the lab when we do research about affect, mood, and emotions. And then we'll take a look at some specific findings that relate to mood as it influences our cognitions and our downstream behavior. So there are a bunch of different ways that mood can influence us, and we will get started with looking at how mood can produce some congruence effects. We will also speak about mood affecting cognitive processing, how we regulate mood, and how mood affects attention. And then we'll take a look at some more specific examples of emotions affecting us. And we'll speak about appraisal theories. We will talk about the difference between anger and fear and how it affects our behavior. And we'll also speak about the somatic marker hypothesis. Okay, but first, let's get started with some definitions. So what is the difference between affect, mood, and emotion? And what do we mean when we actually talk about these three things? So affect is used as a very general term, and it's used in a way that's meant to capture both emotion and mood. Now, mood is about broad, diffuse, long-lasting affect, and it usually refers to mood that is either positive or negative. So it's a general type of affect. And when we talk about mood, for instance, we do this to talk about spillover effects. So maybe you feel good because something happened in one domain of your life, and then that spills over into another domain of your life and makes you like something better. So for instance, if you're watching this video while you're feeling good because you had a nice breakfast today, it might make you like this video better. Okay, so that's mood. The idea of mood is that it's really this very broad, diffuse feeling up or down. And then we also have emotions. And emotions are a type of affect, or we refer to emotions when we talk about something something specific. So they are usually directed at something or at someone. They're rather acute and short-lived. Again, they can be positive or negative, so there's some valence involved here as well, but they're more specific. So, for instance, we would compare things like anger, disgust, and fear, and you can tell they're all kind of negative, but the way you think about them exactly still differs, so you can tell apart anger and disgust and fear usually. Yeah, so that is the idea of differentiating affect, mood, and emotion. So affect is our umbrella term, and then mood is the next rather broad term that we could use, and emotion really is for very, very specific targeted types of affect. Okay, so now that we've got this terminology straight, we can take a look at the next thing on our schedule, which is to think about how we can induce affect. Well, and I think the first thing to do for that is for you to think yourself what makes you feel things in everyday life, like what makes you feel good or bad or specific emotions in everyday life. So for instance, if you come to university usually on a bike, as we do in the Netherlands, and you come to the bike rack and you see it's this full, how does it make you feel? Well, either you could say it can produce something like a generalized mood for the day, and if the day already started in a bad way, perhaps this carries through for the rest of your day. Or it could make you even have a specific emotion. Maybe you're angry that everyone else has already arrived at university and stolen your bike spot. Who knows? What I'd like you to do now is to take a moment and pause this video to think about some examples for things that induce affect in your everyday life. Welcome back. Now, I'm sure you thought of some examples for how affect can be induced in your everyday life. And just to make sure that we're all on the same starting point, I want to give some examples myself. So we've already spoken about the bike rack, but something that many people believe affects their mood, or at least I know it's true for me. When the sun is shining outside, then I usually have a better mood than when, like today, it's a little bit more gloomy. Also, if you watch the news and there's some good or bad news, that can affect the mood that you have. If you get a present from someone, that can spark specific emotions like surprise or joy. If you get a promotion at work, that might also make you feel something exciting in your everyday life. Reading a good book, watching a specific movie, going for having a nice dinner, some memories, and sometimes even our own thoughts. So there are really, literally so many things that can make us feel, that induce affect in our daily lives. Now, while the question for everyday life is it seems pretty trivial to you, right? It is a bit more tricky though to induce affect in the lab, right? Because sometimes in the lab we want to study affect or how it affects our behavior and our cognitions. But for that, we have to create it in the lab. And as some of you may know, if you've taken part in an experiment, the lab's usually not a place where you have pleasant memories or you eat a nice breakfast. So how indeed can we induce affect in the lab? This is a question that I'd encourage you to take a pause for a minute in this video and think about whether you experienced a study where you took part as a participant where someone induced affect, or if you can come up with your own ideas of, if you wanted to study affect, how would you make your participants feel in a specific way? Okay, I'm sure you had some exciting ideas for how affect can be introduced in the lab. And now let's take a look at some routes that this has actually been done in research in the past. There are really a number of different strategies that have been taken. Perhaps one of the most popular ones is using what's called autobiographical recall. So here the idea is that participants are asked about a specific episode in their life where they've experienced a specific emotion. And then they're asked to recall this and sometimes to also write it down. And usually the instruction then would be something like, try to remember an event in your recent past where you have felt, let's say, happy. And then recall this event and write it down and be so precise about it that someone else who reads your description would know exactly how you feel. So through this autobiographical recall, the idea is that you create something like almost like an incidental emotion, and that this emotion comes back from our memories of our own previous happiness, and then would be available in the lab and could then spill over into later behavior, for instance. So that's one way to do it, to ask participants to recall something that's specific to their own autobiographical experience. But of course, that's a bit tricky because you might have people who experience happiness to a very different degree in their autobiographical recall. So if you have someone who's just not had a very happy period of time in the recent past, then it might be a really hard task for them to come up with a story about how they were happy in the recent past. So you might get some troubles there because it might be difficult for participants to be argued to be all on the same level of happiness in their memories. Right? So another way of inducing in the lab the affect that we're looking for might be to ask participants to read a story. So here you have full control over the material, right? You as the experimenter. You give the same story or stories that differ in specific regards, which you again have control over, to your participants. That means because you have this experimental control, at least you can control what goes into the participant, right? What they process. And if you give someone a happy story and compare this with a story that you think should make people feel sad, this might create your affect in the lab. Now, of course, you still don't know if everyone is going to react to your story in the same way. That's an assumption you have to make, but you gain some control over the input that you give your participants. Another way to induce affect is to ask participants to listen to music. Now, if you go through your music library and you ask yourself, which is the music that I listen to when I'm in a happy mood, when I'm out and ready to party, for instance, or what kind of music do you listen to when you're sad and maybe you are having an evening on your sofa where you're not feeling well, and maybe you need a good cry. I'm sure many of you have a specific playlist for exactly that mood. And that idea we can also use in the lab. So there's some music that really activates us and makes us feel joyful. And then there's other specific music that can make you feel angry or suspenseful. Horror movies entirely rely on this idea, right? If you've ever tried watching a horror movie without a sound, it's not nearly as scary because you can't hear the suspenseful music. Speaking of movies, watching movies can actually be a way to induce affect in the lab. So I don't know, you probably have a movie yourself that you have to think about now when I tell you think about the saddest movie you've ever seen. And many people actually agree on what sad movies are. So we can leverage this and use clippings from these movies in the lab to induce specific emotions. Looking at emotionally laden pictures might also help. So there are big inventories available with pre-tested pictures that usually make participants feel one way or the other. Yeah, this is another way we can induce affect in the lab. What you might also consider is giving participants a compliment. That, compliments usually make people feel good. Giving participants feedback about their performance in a specific task might also induce specific feelings. And another way to go might be hypnosis, but whether or not that we think that's actually a credible way to induce affect might actually be something interesting for you to research. But so hypnosis is not often used. And like I said in the beginning, the more usually used inductions are things like autobiographical recall, or in fact watching movies and listening to music and looking at emotionally laden pictures. So this is an overview of how we may induce affect in the lab, and at least some ideas, which of course need to be tailored for the specific research question. But this is a broad overview for the moment.